Welcome to the Botanic Gardens Biosecurity webinar series. Welcome to the third webinar of the series. Welcome to all of our online viewers. I'm Daniela Carnival. I'm from Plant Health Australia and the Botanic Gardens Biosecurity Network. Now, a little bit about the webinar series. So this webinar series is being coordinated by the Botanic Gardens Biosecurity Network. And the network is coordinated by Plant Health Australia with support from expert collaborators. This project's funded by the Australian Government's Agricultural Competitiveness White Paper, which is the government's plan for stronger farms and a stronger economy. So before we get into today's talks, I just want to go through a few webinar housekeeping things. So all attendees today will be on mute. Today we have a panel that's comprised of the project team from Plant Health Australia. The panel will be here today to be answering any of your questions. So we will, or asking those questions on to our talker today. We'll be answering questions throughout the webinar using the chat function. So please feel free to ask any questions using the chat box. We will try our best to answer any questions throughout the webinar. However, if we can't answer any questions, we will take those questions on and answer them at a later date and distribute those answers. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Botanic Gardens Biosecurity Network website, as well as our Facebook page. So on to today's talk. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Brett Summerell, who's Director of Research and Chief Botanist at the Botanic Gardens and Centennial Parklands in Sydney. He's going to be talking today to us about some of the major pests and diseases that impact the gardens. He's also going to be going through some of the methods to prevent their introduction and spread and what's involved in diagnosing diseases. So with that, I won't talk too much more. I'll pass on to Brett, who can get straight into his talk. Thanks, Brett.
Thanks, Daniela. So as Daniela mentioned, my name's Brett Summerell. I'm the Director of Research and Chief Botanist at the Botanic Gardens in Sydney, and have been working there predominantly as a plant pathologist for 30 odd years, so gained a little bit of experience over that point in time. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the biosecurity that occurs in the sort of biosecurity issues that are relevant to our botanic gardens, but probably also relevant to most of the botanic gardens around Australia and internationally, and of course to anybody who's managing a large open space or even their own home garden. There we go. So the first thing that's probably worth mentioning is when I talk about the Botanic Gardens of Sydney, I'm talking about 3 sites in particular. We also have responsibility for Centennial Parklands, which is Centennial Park, Moore Park and Queen's Park, which also have a whole range of different species, but I'll focus today mostly on about the Botanic Gardens per se. So the first one obviously is the Royal Botanic Garden of Sydney, 204 years old this week, in fact, on the 13th of June, and quite a historic site and quite an iconic site in terms of where it's located and its prominence in terms of Sydney as a tourist facility and as a very, very widely used space. It's the heritage. It's very much a heritage gardens with a lot of heritage plantings, a lot of those sort of traditional plantings that you'd expect to see in a botanic garden. So, you know, your things like a herb garden, a rose garden, all of those sorts of conventional type plants, but also with an overstory of trees, which includes your standard oaks, etc., but also a really quite a nice and broad range of subtropical tree species, particularly from across the north coast, northern regions of New South Wales and up in through to the southern parts of Queensland. In quite a lot of contrast to that is the Australian Botanic Garden at Mount Annan, 416 hectares or thereabouts of very much open rolling plains, formerly a dairy site and a riding facility, now with a broad range of species that all are Australian species in nature. So big displays of Australian plants, from a range of different floras, from the tropics through to the desert regions and down into the cool climate species. So a very broad range of different species, but all Australian plants, all with their own unique issues and requirements, many of which are still unexplored and undiscovered. So, the typical sorts of plantings that you might see, some of the iconic species like waratahs, paper daisy displays, and a broad range of plantings at that site. The third garden is the Blue Mountains Botanic Garden at Mount Tomah, stuck right in the middle of a World Heritage area, which brings its own issues, particularly in terms of biosecurity and disease management, but also a really interesting context in terms of when you get fires and impacts of the like, as we've seen this past just before Christmas with the Gospers Mountain fire, which came through and devastated about a quarter of the Botanic Gardens at Mount Tomah and all of our conservation woodland that we look after adjacent to the gardens, around about close to 200 hectares of that in that space. So a spectacular garden with amazing views over the Blue Mountains, with a range of cool climate plants in the displays there, some of which are very unique, like these puyas. So a broad range of species, as you can quite imagine from that, and can be quite a challenge from the point of view of biosecurity. If you look at the statistics of what's in the gardens, across the three sites, there's a total of 17,232 species across the three gardens. And some of the more interesting factors in that are that we have 12 species in the garden that are extinct in the wild, 614 critically endangered species based on the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature criteria. So 614 critically endangered species brings around its own requirements, its own challenges in order to do that. And each of the gardens is extraordinarily unique in terms of the environment that you have there. So you've got the subtropical, coastal, very humid and higher rainfall areas of the Sydney Garden, the quite challenging environmental conditions at the Australian Botanic Garden at Mount Annan, clay soils, quite often very hot summers with low rainfall, half the rainfall, around about average half the rainfall at Mount Annan compared to Sydney, so 600 mils per annum to 1200 mils per annum in a good year. And at Mount Tomah, you've got quite cold, on occasion snow occurring in the winter, beautiful soils, beautiful basalt soils that really are favourable for growing things. And of course, when you combine 17,000 hosts with a range of different pathogens and these three unique environments, you get any number of types of possible disease scenarios, which I've illustrated there with the classic disease triangle that pathologists tend to work with in terms of what we're talking about. And then just a little comment at the bottom. It must be quite easy for human doctors to only have to worry about one species when compared to what we have to worry about with 17,000 odd species, individual species. Of course, plants tend to complain less than human patients, and it is often quite a lot easier to just pull up a plant if you've got a disease problem compared to the issues that you might have to face with humans. And then on top of that, you have the complications of visitation. So we get over 5 million visitors per annum at the Sydney site. We've just hit 500,000 visitors at the Australian Botanic Garden at Mount Annan last week. So that's quite a milestone for us. And Mount Tomah can get up to a couple of 100,000 visitors per annum. So in periods of time, you have a very high visitation, visitors coming from all around the world, all around the country and all around the state on any given day, and each of them bringing their own potential contamination that they might bring into the garden. So it's not unusual for tourists to get off the planes at Sydney Airport, having at 6 a.m. in the morning, and then having to wander around the gardens, waiting for their hotels to open, and of course, getting straight off the plane with disease or pest problems is a scenario which could result in new incursions quite easily, and hence the reason for why we have the Botanic Gardens Network, Biosecurity Network. We have all the standard diseases that you'd expect to see in a botanic garden. So roses with the black spot and a whole range of different diseases, powdery mildews, just a nice example of myrtle rust on Syzygium jambos, the exotic Syzygium there. So all of the standard diseases that you might expect to see in a botanic garden, we do of course get those. Our focus has always been on trying to manage those diseases rather than what probably was more the scenario when I first started as a pathologist at the Botanic Gardens, was to look at what options we had in terms of pesticide use. Now it's very much looking at, is there a better cultivar? Is there a better species that we can grow in that situation that's going to avoid those sorts of diseases? At the Sydney Botanic Gardens, like many of the older established botanic gardens around Australia, our biggest issues tend to be those root diseases that are often insidious, very difficult to detect and document prior to a tree being quite adversely affected. So Malaria Root Rot has been a big problem for our tree population at the Sydney Botanic Gardens for many, many years. This is a interesting native fungus, an Australian indigenous fungus that attacks a really broad range of woody perennials, causes it to rot and eventually girdles the tree, as you can see here in this top photo, girdles the tree, cutting off the vascular system so that the tree gets dieback, can become difficult to maintain its stability, and all sorts of problems arise from that. This is a big problem in a number of the other botanic gardens around the country, and I've certainly done some work on the Australian National Botanic Garden in Canberra and on the Royal Tasmanian Botanic Garden in Hobart, all having similar problems with this particular fungus, which produces these spectacular fruiting bodies late May, early June, seeing quite a few of them around at the present point in time, particularly as we've had wet weather. The other big issue that we deal with is Phytophthora Root Rot. I've put a couple of environmental shots here to illustrate the sort of damage that we get, that you might see. The Xanthorrhoea on the right-hand side of the screen is at Werrikimbe National Park, have been affected by Phytophthora infestation there. And, these 3 metre high, probably 300, 400-year-old Xanthorrhoeas being killed by the pathogen. And certainly over at North Head in the eucalypt forests there and Angophora forests, we're seeing this dieback quite widespread. It's a big problem in botanic gardens all around the place and in gardens everywhere, and very difficult to control once you get an infestation there. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the issues that we have there. We've done a lot of work looking at the impact of Phytophthora on the Wallamai pine, which is quite a susceptible and easily killed tree by Phytophthora, and causing that sort of problem, working on the population in the natural site, but also looking at how we can control the disease using bark painting with phosphonate chemicals and sprays to try and control this pathogen in those sorts of scenarios. Botanic gardens are also interesting sites for new records of diseases. So over the past 20 or 30 years, we've recorded many new pathogens that are either new to science completely or are new records for Australia across the country. Blue Mountains Botanic Gardens at Mount Tomah is the centre of most of the disease outbreaks for proteas, and that's not because they have a particularly disease-ridden complex. It's just that we've done a very focused amount of work there in the past. This particular fusarium species on Agapanthus, for example, is a new species that was discovered at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Melbourne, and which I was involved with Jackie Edwards describing this as a new species, recorded only at the RBG Melbourne and also in a few gardens in northern Italy, of all places. They're probably widespread in Agapanthus, and under the right conditions will cause this problem. At the Australian Botanic Gardens, we have many new records of plant pathogens and plant diseases in the collections there. This is just a factor of that we're collecting and displaying, often material collected from the wild, material species that may never have been assessed in terms of their pathogens or assessed in the sorts of diseases that they get. And in this particular case of Podocarpus from the Australian Botanic Gardens was, we were looking for particular pathogens, leaf pathogens on it, and it was one of those species and described a new species to science. And there's about, I know, the gardens at Mount Annan are a type site for a number of species that have been described there. Control methods and management practices of disease control in Botanic Gardens has changed an enormous amount over the 30 years that I've been involved in this area. Now, particularly, our focus is on preventing avoidance of pathogens, quarantine where we need to. Removal is sometimes removal of an infected individual to protect the herd. The opposite of herd immunity that we're seeing now, it can be a very important thing. And awareness is a really critical thing, and probably the most important thing that we can do in terms of raising awareness in both the horticultural staff, but also amongst the people that are visiting the site. Generally now, pesticide use is the last resort, if at all used. I believe that if, with a careful understanding of the likely diseases that we get, prevention and avoidance is a critical thing. And if there is a species that we're growing that is continually being impacted by particular diseases, whether it's particular cultivars of roses that are suckers for black spot or the like, then it's really about trying to look at opportunities to replace those species so that you get a better outcome in terms of disease avoidance. So pesticide usually is the last resort. And I know that a lot of the gardens around the country have developed this understanding of gardens hygiene, working with those gardens to make sure that people entering facilities are not bringing in disease. And it's really about awareness. Some places have foot baths and cleaning measures work really well if people use them, but they don't work well if people don't use them. So it's really about making sure that the awareness is high, necessarily, regardless of whether you have foot baths or don't have foot baths or cleaning equipment or whatever. An awareness of making sure that wherever you go into, you make the best effort to make sure that you're not bringing in disease-causing organisms. You're not likely to improve the outcome for disease to develop, and you're not likely to be the source of a new infection. So really important to look at options for that so that you minimise that. And that can be ensuring secateurs are clean between cutting back rose bushes, chainsaws are clean between trimming phoenix palm fronds, or in this case, entering into sites and making sure that you are disease-free as best as possible. We're quite fortunate at the Botanic Gardens Sydney that we have a well-established plant clinic and plant disease research and diagnostic program. It's quite unique worldwide to have this program. So the plant disease diagnostic unit at Plant Clinic works as a commercial diagnostic resource, but also in improving people's awareness and understanding with all this interpretation that you can see on the left-hand side, so that people are more aware. So we run the plant disease diagnostic unit services, and with a very special focus on tree diseases, because they're the most problematic that we deal with, but we deal with all sorts of issues from that space. And you can see the range of disease problems that you might be accounting, things with branch failures and the like, fungal decay and phoenix dieback, all of those sorts of diseases are really important. Using different types of techniques, moving more and more these days to using detection methods based on DNA diagnostics, so we can provide a methodology that gives you a very rapid diagnosis and response with recommendations very quickly because of the power of DNA tools and the technology available to do that. One of the things that I really wanted to push was making sure that people were particularly aware of the number of tree diseases and the potential for new incursions coming into Australia. So whether it's diseases like cowrie dieback, they're prominent in the North Island, in the agathis populations there, with this relatively newly described species of Phytophthora, sudden oak death in California, and in a number of the big box hardware companies across the whole of the US now, and with a very broad range, which includes some of our species that we have concerns with, and through to things like ash dieback, which are causing huge problems right across the whole of Europe and the United Kingdom. There's any number of these sorts of species that are arising, concerns in Indonesia recently with different types of wilts and diebacks in the acacia, both weedy acacias and plantation acacias in those regions, causing big problems there. So there's lots and lots of diseases, adult waiting to get in and waiting to cause these sorts of problems if we were to let them do that. So really critical. And even with diseases like myrtle rust, where we already have the disease within Australia, there are clones and genotypes of this pathogen that are sitting in places like Hawaii and in the US that are much more virulent than the particular pathogen that we have here now, the particular strain that we have here now. So it's really important to maintain biosecurity, maintain biosecurity in botanic gardens, and increase awareness so that we're all playing a role in terms of ensuring Australia's biosecurity outcomes. And that, I think, covers me. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that, Brett. It was such an informative talk, and there's a lot clearly happening in the gardens within the Sydney region. So it was really great to hear from you. We've actually got a little bit of time for questions. So if anyone does have any questions, it'd be fantastic if you could pop them into the chat box, and I can relay those questions straight on to Brett. So a question from Lucy: are there any particular things that you're doing to encourage uptake of biosecurity by the public?
Yeah, there is. We, I think in one of those shots I showed of Plant Clinic, what we've done there is to put a whole range of interpretation that is particularly targeted and accessible. So it's a range of interpretation describing what biosecurity is about, what plant pathology is about, and also looking at what people can do in terms of their own home gardens, home situations. So it's really about trying to talk to the community so that they're aware. And we've particularly set up the building so that the people can look through the windows into the labs and see what's happening there. And particularly it gets used a lot by school groups coming into the garden. So that works really well.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Deb. Do any plant diseases cross to humans?
Mostly that's the case. That's not the case. Most of the pathogens that affect plants don't cross over to humans. Mostly they're focused on plants. There are a couple of exceptions where you can get contaminations by some of the pathogens, fungal pathogens, but that's generally an issue with immune suppressed people.
Great. Now a question from Beck. Is the biosecurity work of the gardens written up anywhere for reference?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of stuff. We have quite a lot of information on our website. There's also an episode or two of our podcast called Branch Out, which focuses very much on both the work that we do at the gardens in terms of biosecurity, but some of the broader issues in terms of biosecurity and how it affects plant health and human health. So there's a range of different material, and certainly I've written a few things that are blog posts that are up on the Gardens website for people to look at. We have a couple of some more recent papers looking at the impact of Phytophthora in botanic gardens that if people are interested, they can drop me a note and I'll send a copy of the PDF to them.
Great. Okay, so we have a question from Chris. Given your observation on big box stores in the US observing disease management, would you suggest that our big box stores should adopt the nursery industry BMP schemes, NIA, SA, EcoHort and Biosecure HACCP?
I do think it would be sensible if those sort of procedures and accreditation schemes were rolled out into that sort of those sort of industries. What's happened in the US is that there has been some of these diseases, particularly the Phytophthora Root, had been moved from a nursery into a number of different types of stores, and that caused issues in terms of the biosecurity response there. But I think it would be anything that improves nursery accreditation and biosecurity is an ideal thing to do.
Great. Bev is curious to know how the removal of African olive infestation at Mount Annan is coming along. So
it's going very well. There's still a lot. It's a big infestation. It's a horrendous weed in terms of an invasive species. There's still some substantial amount to be done, but there's been continual work on the removal of it year on year, and it's really starting to show in terms of the improvement in the whole ecosystem there.
Right. Another question from Ruth. Are there any biosecurity hotspots along the Great Dividing Range?
Yeah, the Great Dividing Range.
Big area.
Yeah, it is a big area. It's an interesting question because there are obviously areas where myrtle rust infestation is, particularly as we move up into the north of Sydney, up the north coast, up into Queensland, myrtle rust issues from there. There are Phytophthora issues in many of the areas through the outbreaks in places like Mount Imlay National Park and a number of national parks throughout New South Wales, some of the Gondwanan parks, and then up into issues with Phytophthora on bunya pines around Brisbane that people are working with. So there are a range of biosecurity issues there, and certainly there are enough complications without introducing more virulent strains of myrtle rust or additional pathogens like Phytophthora ramorum or the like.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Brett. I think we've run out of time, and that's a good point to end on. We'll hopefully be able to answer any unanswered questions and provide those answers back to all attendees, as well as the recorded webinar. If I could now get you just to quickly fill in a poll before you all leave. I'd like to thank you again for your attendance, and I'd like to thank Brett once again for his fantastic talk today.
Pleasure.
So whilst you're filling out that quick survey, we can just have a quick look at the webinar schedule coming up. So in 2 weeks' time, we will be having a talk by one of the other surveillance networks, the Urban Plant Health Network, who will be giving a talk on looking out for pests in urban gardens. So I think there was a question about what can urban gardeners do, or what can we look out for in urban gardens? Well, join us in 2 weeks' time, and hopefully we can answer some of those questions.